So now that we have housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the Indigenous history of the lands we will speak about during this presentation. The Luckiamute and Ash Creek watershed and all of the areas where the Luckiamute Watershed Council has its service are part of the homelands of the Kalapuya, who today are represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, whose relationship with this land continues today. On behalf of the Luckiamute Watershed Council, I offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for many generations, and for the opportunity to learn, work, and be in community on this land as we partner with so many others to help restore the health of this watershed. Finally, I do want to also thank Willamette Habitat Restoration Fund for their support of our Love Your Watershed events. Our Love Your Watershed events are designed to inspire and empower people to protect and restore and do more on their land to safeguard the health of our rivers and our lands. And we also want to bring awareness and partnership with others in the completion of our goals to protect the health of our watershed. So I thank Willamette Habitat Restoration Fund for the ability to bring this presentation for you tonight. And I especially want to thank Lindsay McClary and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde for partnering with us tonight to bring this presentation to you. And with that, I welcome Lindsay, and please take it away.
Thank you. Suzanne, can you just give me a thumbs up if you hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, awesome. Hi, everybody. I can't see you, but I hope that you can see me in this presentation. So let's see here. There we go. Okay, so thanks, Suzanne, for that wonderful introduction. Again, my name is Lindsay McClary, and I am the Habitat Restoration Ecologist for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I am not an enrolled tribal member with Grand Ronde, but my husband is, and he has served in many different capacities for the tribe. I am an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I've lived in Oregon since 2009, and I've worked for the tribe for over 10 years in fish and wildlife programming. My current position focuses on habitat protection, restoration, and enhancement, and my role contributes to tribal landscape management, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. So I think everybody probably got to see the summary, but I'm just going to read it real quick for those folks who didn't. Since time immemorial, the tribe has been the historical land manager of the Willamette Valley. The native plants and animals are intrinsic resources to the tribe as they form the foundation to historic traditions and values. Although tribes were removed from their ancestral homelands, people never lost their connections to place. Today, the tribe continues land management practices both on and off tribal lands throughout the Willamette Valley. A look into past, present, and future landscape management describes how traditional practices are not relics of the past, but are reflections of today's cultural values. So what I think the tribe, when we all think about the past, it can feel really disconnected in some ways of life that have been lost in modern culture and seem just really distant. I also think it's typical for people to be most connected with the present and the time period that they're living in. To see these time periods as linear separate entities as they're sort of drawn across the screen right there. This gives rise to the thought that traditional tribal practices are historic and they're no longer existing today. What I think the tribe has taught me is that these concepts aren't linear at all, but instead they're interconnected and they're on a continuum. I think the most important takeaway from this concept is that culture is not in the past. Tribal culture exists today and it evolves through time. There are many ways to connect with cultural practices. The tribe has a whole cultural resources department and many experts on this topic. I'm going to touch on a few concepts tonight as they relate to my role in lands management. So to understand the present day tribal lands management, I think it's really important to recognize a little bit on where we come from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tribe's past. So since time immemorial, the tribes really have lived on these landscapes. The landscapes are a reflection of human management. In Western Oregon and the Willamette Valley, it provided resources for lifeways and traditions. One of the tribes this area were most known for were the Kalapuya. They were noted for their seasonal rounds, moving throughout the valley during different times of the year as resources became available. They're also noted for their cultural burning practices, which help keep these landscapes in open prairies in savanna conditions. This helped with vegetation management for materials as well as food resources. Settlement came in the 1850s with Western expansion, and Western Oregon began to experience settlement in a rapid rate. This brought agricultural and farming lifeways to the valley. It led to widespread habitat conversion as these lands were highly productive for agricultural production. And during this time period, tribes and native peoples began to be displaced from their homelands. The map on the right here shows the Trail of Tears, which began in 1856 from Table Rock down on the bottom of the map. On March 22, the group passed over the Luckiamute River. In March 25th, they actually arrived in Grand Ronde. This trip took 33 days, traveled 263 miles, and there were 8 deaths recorded, but also 8 births during this trip. The Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde are comprised of over 27 bands and tribes that were removed from their homelands. This area actually covers quite a large section stretching from Southwest Washington to Northern California. These lands were ceded to the US government under 6 different treaties within 2 years. And some of the main tribes included the Umpqua, Molalla, Rogue River, Kalapuya, and Shasta. Although the tribes were removed from these landscapes and relocated to Grand Ronde, people never lost their connections to place. About 100 years later came the Western Oregon Indian Termination Act of 1954. Essentially, it was part of an assimilation policy. This photo to the right is Grace Wheeler of the Kalapuya tribe. She worked with ethnographers in the early 1900s to document Kalapuya language and people. This stripped both the CTGR and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of their federal status. It led to further hardships, and tribal people began to leave the Grand Ronde area in pursuit of improving their conditions. However, some tribal members refused to accept this fate, and in the 1970s, tribal leadership began traveling to Washington, D.C. to testify for the tribe and argue for the restoration of the tribe's federal status. In 1983, the Restoration Act was passed and Grand Ronde was restored. Since then, the tribe has continued to rebuild, including cultural connections, reacquisitions of lands, and landscape management. This brings us to present day, and I think it's important to recognize where we are today has been shaped by the past, and today's present is a reflection of tradition, connections to landscape, and experiences. Today, the tribe operates in 3 main ways. The tribal government is a sovereign entity that is recognized by the federal government. It's led by 9 elected officials called Tribal Council. The picture to the right is Tribal Council in 1995, standing on what is now the Spirit Mountain Casino location. So the casino is the business side of the tribe, and Tribal Council oversees both the government and the casino. Spirit Mountain Community Fund is the philanthropic arm of the tribe. It uses a percentage of casino revenue and distributes grants to nonprofits in 11 county service area, government agencies in Polk and Yamhill counties, and to the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. So anyone out there doing landscape management or really any good work in the community, there's a couple different specific Spirit Mountain Community Fund grants that would be eligible and available. I would encourage you to check out the website if you haven't and aren't aware of that resource. So talk a little bit about the tribal government. It has several departments, including cultural resources, health and wellness, housing. It offers a lot of programs. It basically operates like its own little city, its own little government. It's very self-sufficient and provides resources for both tribal members and non-tribal members. It offers a lot of programs and services, including social services, education, and a health clinic that has provided COVID-19 vaccines to several people, not just tribal members and tribal elders. So if you or someone you know is interested in a vaccine and hasn't received it yet, I encourage you to look at the website. I know it's helped a lot of community members. Currently, the tribe has reacquired 16,115 acres of land that was previously ceded to the federal government. This includes approximately 14,000 acres that are managed by the Natural Resources Department, which is where I work. Others are managed for government, infrastructure, and housing. So talk a little bit about the department that I work for. The Natural Resources Department houses programs including recreation, environmental protection, timber and roads, silviculture and fire protection, and fish and wildlife, which is part of the team that I work for. We have approximately 20 full-time staff and many seasonals with summer crews. We handle a lot of management of resources and assist both on and off tribal lands. I want to talk a little bit about some of the tribal lands management concepts and how the tribe approaches land management. So the first one is stewardship. The mission of the Tribal Natural Resources Department itself is to serve the tribal membership through responsible stewardship of all natural resources important to the cultural identity, self-sufficiency, and sovereignty of future and current generations. When we do this is through management plans. We operate on a 10-year planning cycle that includes a suite of actions on the landscapes, including recreation, fish and wildlife habitat, and timber management. The management plans tie back to the tribe's vision of responsible resource stewardship by planning for utilization now, but also preserving the resource for 7 generations, meaning that in 7 generations from now, we will be the ancestors, and what we do as stewards will become the ancestry of the future. Oh, I actually want to back up real quick. I wonder if I can do that. Oops. I did just want to point out that the pictures that you're seeing on the inset as the bottom left is stripped hazel bark that's ready for basketry making. And then the larger picture on the right is from a historical time period where ancestors were gathering hazel, but it's definitely post-European settlement. So the other concept I wanted to touch on is managing for abundance. So this leads into the concept of there is a balance between utilization now and cultivation for the future. So like anything, this is tied to the resource and is site specific. There's 2 examples here. The larger picture is lamprey harvest. This is an important cultural pursuit at Willamette Falls. It's a highly culturally significant species because it really got tribal members through the winter time. They have a high fat content and high oil content, so they sustain tribes during the winter months. They were dried and eaten throughout the year, and they are in decline. So the tribe has done a lot for conservation. We've done telemetry studies, we've done translocation studies, and our whole fisheries program within natural resources is really focused on lamprey conservation and management to be able to continue to utilize that resource and collect from Willamette Falls. The second example is the inset picture there, and that is a pile of camas bulbs. So this is also significant. It's a cultural species that is usually baked in camas ovens within the earth. The Willamette Valley was once dominated by dense camas patches, and it's a plant that requires management, and it really likes disturbance. The more disturbed it is, the more it thrives and produces. The largest bulbs are usually harvested, and much like tulips or lilies or daffodils, they'll create each year they'll create smaller little bulbs off the larger ones. So the larger ones are harvested, and then the smaller ones either fall off naturally or are replanted. Camas also loves disturbance because then it stays closer to the surface. If a camas patch is not managed, those bulbs will be so deep in the earth that it's really hard to actually harvest them. So that's a species that's actively managed. And then the third concept that I wanted to talk a little bit more about is traditional ecological knowledge. So it really begins through a connection with landscapes. There's no cookie cutter prescription that fits the box for TEK to say something is considered TEK or something is not. It's just really site specific. And it reinforces that the resource and site is site specific, and it depends on what is occurring on that landscape now as compared to what the historic use was, and is there a connection to reconcile that? So my experience with TEK has really been surrounding vegetation, plant knowledge, plant uses, cultivation, management, like we talked about with the camas. There's two examples here. So the larger picture on the right is Brodia. It's in the camas family, so it's a similar bulb-like root structure. And it could be eaten raw in small amounts, or it could be cooked the same as camas, or sometimes a lot coupled with camas in those earthen ovens. The inset is a tarweed flower. So the seed is harvested in mass, and it could be processed into meal, flour, or oil. It has an edible root, but it's mostly known for its nutritious seed, and it's mostly known for its oil-making capacity. So TEK is a great example of how past, present, and future are all connected. Traditional ecological knowledge from tribal ancestors is applied in a landscape today, which will influence future knowledge. And just like culture, it evolves with time. Right now, we're working with a tribal member on one of our prairie properties called Noble Oaks, and they're just creating a tarweed patch. Apparently, tarweed can grow in really dense thickets, and it does okay. But if the plants are spaced out by about 12 inches a piece, they really generate quite a bit of seed just from that one plant. So we're just starting a tarweed cultivation project on one of our conservation properties, working with a tribal member, and so that's really exciting for us. So I want to talk a little bit about tribal lands management and current practices. So we've talked a little bit about the history and where we've come from, a few of the concepts on how we approach lands management, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about exactly what I do in my role and how I apply those perspectives. So the tribe's current land holdings total just over 16,000 acres, and they stretch throughout the Willamette Valley, really from Tillamook down to Monroe, east of Salem and up to Portland, kind of scattered throughout the valley. Again, these are the historic ceded lands of the different tribes that make up the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Right now, my position manages about 2,000 acres that are held for fish and wildlife habitat conservation. Those are reacquisitions of landscapes that were historically ceded. These particular properties have been acquired through the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program. That's a program spanning 15 years from 2010 to 2025. And it's a BPA funded and ODF&W managed program, really for real acquisition of property interest to offset BPA's obligations over hydro systems in the Willamette Valley. And so my position works a lot on assisting with those acquisitions, but mostly after acquisition, writing management plans, and implementing habitat restoration and conservation projects on those properties. So a lot of what I do is habitat restoration. So we manage for multiple habitat types. A majority of our properties are oak habitats and riparian floodplain forest. We do have wetland prairie, oak woodlands, just a variety of habitats. Most of our work is largely focused on oaks and prairies, because this is the once dominant landscape of the Willamette Valley. These habitats were historically maintained by Kalapuya fire practices, and right now there's about less than 1% of historic prairie and savanna habitat left. Our riparian areas are focused mostly along the North Santiam River. We have almost 900 acres across a few different parcels. What we're focusing on there is floodplain reconnection and recreating those natural dynamic systems that have been impacted by Detroit and Big Cliff dams upstream. This is a picture of some of the habitat restoration that we're doing, and it's really focused on conversion of agricultural landscapes back to riparian hardwood forests. I focus a lot on vegetation removal, largely invasive, but some native species in the upland sites, mostly oak, with encroachment of native trees and shrubs. And then we also do vegetation establishment with replanting. It's the intent to restore native plant communities that are properly functioning. So over time, there's little to no maintenance. This will take a lifetime to happen, especially across those 2,000 acres. I'm only going to have a few, hopefully, decades to impact these habitat types, but really thinking about the amount of time it has taken to convert them to where they are today. It's going to take a lifetime of restoration. So we also focus on plant cultivation, and we have a tribal native plant materials program. The intent is to increase plant materials for habitat restoration, as well as tribal member access to culturally significant plants. This program was developed in 2014 and is grant supported. It's largely grant supported through an OWEB, multiple OWEB grants called Plants for People, with a partnership with Institute of Applied Ecology. But it's also been supported by an Environmental Protection Agency Clean Water Act Section 319 grant. So right now we have a greenhouse, some raised beds, and cutting beds. And what you're looking at now is the larger colorful picture is camas in the springtime, and those beautiful flowers, and then the bulbs are underground. And what you can see on the inset picture is historical collection of camas bulbs. So the Tribal Native Plant Materials Program has really increased the awareness of native plant materials and culturally significant plant materials through site tours. I don't think we anticipated this when it was built, but the amount of tours that Jeremy Oyua, the Native Plant Materials Manager, does a year is almost exponential. And so it's also been a great resource for tribal education programs and departments. The beautiful part of it is it's already on tribal campus, and so access for educational programs is just immediately on site. And one of the best things to watch has been connecting tribal youth to plant cultivation and passing on that traditional ecological knowledge. You can see here the kids come in the fall and they harvest. And then on the inset picture, there's an educational component in the classroom too about plant cultivation. So it's been really cool to just kind of see some of those youth members who have never really even dug in a garden before, just reconnecting to not only camas, but other traditional plants as well. So another thing that the Natural Resources Department does in terms of landscape management is traditional burning and landscape burning. So these landscapes require disturbance to maintain open prairie and savanna conditions. We know from oral histories and European explorers that the Willamette Valley was maintained by fire by the Kalapuya. The inset map is actually a painting, a historical painting of what the Willamette Valley used to look like. And then the picture on the right-hand side is tribal staff burning in Oklahoma in March, conducting habitat burns for wild mustangs. So this practice still occurs today, both on and off tribal lands. And burning is a common practice in hazel management. The disturbance creates growth of tender shoots that are often very straight, and they're ideal material for basketry. Burning is the ideal landscape for long-term management, and it's something that has been, I think, largely removed from the landscape. Utilizing historic burning regimes will reduce management costs over time and more effectively treat sites with less impacts. So a lot of management on these types of habitats, upland prairie, oak savanna, oak woodland, some of the common practices are to mow and then basically do a mechanical and a chemical regime to mimic what fire disturbance would have created. So the mowing, mechanical and chemical regimes really increase time, cost, and impacts to the site. So I'm really interested in reintroducing fire as a management tool versus a chemical, mechanical modification to mimic that. There was a question I think that we got before the presentation. I just thought it would be good to touch on here. The question was, when was the last time widespread native field burning occurred in the Luckiamute watershed area? And really, I think what we can tie that to is during the 1850s, really from the 1850s to the 1900s, the Homestead Act was occurring. So really this encouraged, Americans to seek out lands that were not claimed and to, you could get, I think, about 160 acres per person, and then to improve it by setting up a homestead on it. So really we can think about fire, widespread fire use, probably right before pre-European contact into the 1850s. But another perspective on that is that's certainly widespread. I don't think it's ever actually stopped. And so as Grand Ronde tribal members were displaced to the reservation in Grand Ronde, you had smaller patch burning, so less widespread valley burns, more patch burning for hazel. That still occurs today across tribal member land holdings and also on the reservation. There's tribal member hazel patches that are burned. But it got fragmented to smaller patches, and then as folks moved from the valley into Grand Ronde and kind of settled, I think the fire practices moved more upslope and less down in the valley. So just a little plug on our capacity with the fire program. It was started in the early 1990s at the Natural Resources Department. It's called the Grand Ronde Tribes Wildland Fire Program. And it has really advanced since that time in the early 90s. We have a lot of equipment capacity with several different types of engines, water tenders pictured there with the crew, dozers, and we have staff with multiple levels of qualifications from initial attack to different types of burn bosses. A lot of times these crews go throughout the country for wildland suppression, but they also conduct prescribed burns, like we mentioned in other states, the picture from Oklahoma, but they also burn in partnership program with the Fish and Wildlife Service on the partners program sites, and then on our own landscapes too. So we burn for habitat management, but we also burn for timber production as well. So after timber has been harvested, the tribe does not use any herbicide to suppress native vegetation in timber production. Instead, what we do is broadcast burn, and then that burns the slash for the site, and then we plant after that. So fire is widely used in a lot of what we do today. For the future, what we're looking at is to increase burning authority, because right now, when we do conduct burns, we have to go through the state for smoke management. sometimes that can cause a hiccup in terms of timing when we have projects ready to go on the ground. So really, I think what we're interested in the future is implementing more prescribed fire and having public conversations, community conversations around the fact that fire was a tool and is a tool and has been removed from the landscape. And I think it would really help some of the wildland fires that we've been experiencing. So for me in my program, my list of burn requests is increasing exponentially as we restore habitat. And so really just looking at returning that fire to the landscape in a more regular pattern. But at the end of the day, habitat restoration and maintenance can't be done alone. And a lot of my position is spent fostering partnerships, building new partnerships, strengthening current partnerships, partnering on different projects. In addition, restoration is really expensive. And so looking at what are the short-term restoration costs for the long-term management, certainly if we can use fire for management over mechanical treatments, that's going to be a cost savings over time. And then also thinking that burning can really occur on a 3 to 5 year interval, where mechanical mowing is usually an annual expense and an annual project. So I think it's important to bring parties together for cost sharing. It allows folks with different expertise to contribute for a successful outcome. So one of the cool feel goods about my position is managing landscapes that were historically tribal lands, and assisting and creating opportunities for tribal members to reestablish historic connections to place. And those reconnections lead to landscape utilization through plant materials. Restoration and maintenance efforts prioritize native plants and culturally significant species. And it's also an opportunity for tribal members to reconnect with plant cultivation practices and methods on landscapes that were historically of ancestral connection. And this picture here is basket weavers. And then I just have a few thoughts about the future. So a couple things that kind of roll around in my position, looking at these landscapes and trying to take TEK information, apply it to the landscape now, knowing that what we're doing now is going to shape the future. Looking at plant community shifts. And so what are the microclimates that we have on some of our conservation properties? Can we harvest seed from there, take it back to the Tribal Native Plant Materials Program, grow it to bear root or larger, and then replant it out into those sites? So we're protecting some of the genetic integrity, but also thinking about plant shifting over time as climates change and warm. And also resource availability. What does it mean if plant communities shift and some of those culturally significant plant materials are no longer available? What happens if hazel doesn't grow well anymore in the valley or on these landscapes? I don't have an answer to those questions, but it's some of the questions that we're thinking about. And partnering on research projects. One of our recent projects that we were partnering on is with Bonneville Environmental Foundation, and looking at some of those microclimates and what those plant shifts are telling us now, and what they could be indicating for the future. Also, extreme weather. I mean, we've had I don't know where everybody's tuning in from, but we had some fires this year, and then we had a major ice storm. So kind of thinking, are these normal, or are we just the frogs sitting in the water and the pots being turned on and boiling? Kind of trying to prepare for extreme weather. And then the emphasis on prescribed fire. I mean, I kind of mentioned that just a minute ago, but really I'm most interested in how can we change a culture shift towards fire. A lot of these wildland fires are creating more extreme damage than prescribed fires would be. I think it's a cultural shift with education, but it's also a cultural shift with organizations. So FEMA is already going to be spending that money on emergency services to response to wildfire. What would it look like if we shifted those dollars around and focused on a more proactive approach, reinstating burning and fire regimes on the landscape? Adaptation is going to be huge. So what is TEK like in today's world? I think it's about building awareness. It's building awareness of traditional ecological knowledge. It's building awareness of tribal practices, that the tribe is here, and just really connecting folks to learn about it, to have exposure to it, and connect with folks to have some conversations. I will put in a plug that right now we are partnering with the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District on a regional conservation partnership program that is involving TEK on landscapes. So Polk County residents that are interested in habitat restoration on their properties can learn how to integrate TEK into those landscape prescriptions. What I do know is that the tribe is resilient. They've been resilient throughout time, through different hardships, through different traumas, and they're still here. So I think that we really build resiliency through adaptations. What I would like to reiterate too is that culture is a living and breathing thing. So traditional practices are not something that is a relic of the past or something that's archaic or something that's in a museum. It's practiced today, and it's alive, and it's here. And so I think that the tribe will persevere through time, and they'll always be here. So the inset picture here is a picture of Molalla Kate, and she is a daughter of the chief of the Molalla, and she was the speaker and a keeper of the Molalla language. So what I'll close with is, if folks haven't seen it or haven't seen it in a while, it's a good refresher. So there's a YouTube video that private landowners, Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District, and the tribe partnered on to talk about Oregon's oaks and what's happening to them, how to protect and restore them, and then the tribal connections to those landscapes. So that's it. And at this time, I will take questions.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And I am happy to say that we have some questions already, but I want to invite people to type in your questions in the Q&A as we go, and I will be reading them off, and hopefully Lindsay will be able to answer those. So we have a question that came in earlier during the presentation about what is being planted by the tribes in the riparian areas.
Yeah, so good question. What we're doing right now is a R3 method. So it's a rapid riparian revegetation method. It was developed, it was developed because we know that there's going to be a lot of mortality with the number of stems that you put out there. So thinking that the more stems per acre, the higher survivorship you're going to have, and it's going to cause a quicker canopy to kind of shade out everything else. So what's being planted is a lot of hazel, big leaf maple, cedar. Trying to think of some of the other species. Some Oregon ash, but there's concern about emerald ash borer and what that might mean for the future. As far as I know, we haven't seen it yet in Oregon, but it's definitely happening in the Midwest. It was a big thing in Michigan where I come from, so keeping that on the radar. In terms of the shrub layer, things like snowberry, salmonberry, elderberry, red thimbleberry, trying to think, I have a plant list, many different plant lists, but that's just kind of what's jumping out to me right now.
Great, thank you. And then we also have a question going back to the fires, concerns about You described some of the prescribed fires and the differences between those and the larger wildland fires that have happened, and most recently to a devastating effect, and some concerns in the question about air pollution and folks with lung issues and not wanting to go back to the way the valley air was in the 1960s. Is that something you can address?
Yeah, so smoke management is definitely something that impacts prescribed burning. And like I was mentioning before, the state really regulates smoke management and kind of gives the green light when winds are blowing in the right area or the right direction, excuse me, for prescribed burning. So a lot of pre-planning burn plans are written, fuel types are considered, wind conditions are considered when prescribed burning, and then the conditions have to be right to be able to burn. What I will say is the fuel loads are quite a bit different thinking about prescribed burning. So if there were more often, smaller, regularly occurring fires, there wouldn't be such a fuel load for some of those catastrophic wildfires that have been happening. The other thought is that the prescribed fire can usually kind of run through in a quicker fashion because it doesn't get as hot and isn't as intense. And so when you have those wildland fires, there is no barrier. They're just kind of running wild and they're consuming everything. And so that is not a smoke in the valley that anybody wants to deal with. And so I would just say that those are different smokes, but you know, certainly something that's taken into consideration when planning and executing prescribed burns.
Thank you. And then we have a question about, I'll just read it off here. Some recreation developments have been happening at the confluence of the Luckiamute and the Willamette rivers in recent years. Were the Confederated Tribes involved in this? Can you talk about this and any future plans there may be for this area, including perhaps the Soap Creek drainage and the old Camp Adair Army Base?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I personally I'm not aware of any recreation opportunities that are being developed at the confluence. That's not to say that the tribe was not consulted. I would be interested in learning more about that. Like I mentioned before, we have a recreation department that plans, you know, hiking trails, and it's really kind of focused around camping and outdoor recreation. I'm not familiar with any of the recreation projects that are happening there or Adair or anything like that. So I would say if there's an interest, certainly on the natural resources department side, we'd be interested, but it could also be helpful to loop in cultural resources. So I would say you're welcome to reach out to me. I'd like to, maybe we could have another conversation a little bit more in depth about what's happening there.
Yeah, and I'd like to chime in there. I'm not sure which developments the person asking the question is referring to, but Luckiamute Watershed Council is working with the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department on a floodplain reconnection project there near the confluence of the Luckiamute and the Willamette at the Luckiamute natural area, the Luckiamute State Natural Area. And so that is something that has been a long time in the making and involved a lot of preparatory assessments and consultations, and is now just getting off the ground with plantings. And there was a big earth moving to allow the historic floodplain, the river, to be able to access its historical floodplain and provide more of that habitat that had been lost over the years. And there, because it just started, we don't have yet, our vision is to produce a video, a kind of a starting from the very earliest time of when we started to do the earth moving with our partners up into the planting, and then how it changes over time. And if you go to our website, I'm going to put it here in the chat for a minute, you can go to our projects page and look for the Luckiamute floodplain reconnection project. And if that is the project that the questioner is referring to, hopefully that'll help in answer some of those questions. So there's our website. and yeah, just navigate to the projects page. So yeah, well, thank you. And right now there aren't any open questions, but I do want to ask you specifically, maybe for selfish reasons, but I have visited several years ago, 4 years ago, the Noble Oak site, and I know there's an interesting story to that and how the tribes acquire, how it was acquired by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. Could you give a little brief story about that?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'll start from, way back probably 7, 8, 9 years ago now. I used to live in McMinnville. I live in West Salem now, but I used to live in McMinnville. And so I would drive by on Highway 18 there, and I had coworkers tell me, oh, look, you can see a rhinoceros or you can see a giraffe. And I never did see anything. And I actually didn't believe them. I thought I was getting fooled. But turns out that Dick and Nancy Noble used to run a wildlife preserve there. And it was mostly African animals, black rhinos, giraffes, kudus, all types of crazy exotic animals. And so actually the Nature Conservancy acquired a conservation easement on Noble Oaks through the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program. So they acquired it in 2 phases. The main acreage is about 460 acres, and that was the Dick and Nancy Noble Wildlife Preserve. There's some other acres now lower down on Highway 18, but TNC had it. TNC had it. They wrote a management plan. They did a lot of prairie restoration. And then it's to my knowledge that TNC in recent years has been interested in divesting some of their properties, either for management reasons or they needed properties closer to offices. I'm not exactly sure why, but I think in 2017 or 18, TNC staff approached tribal staff about divesting Noble Oaks to Grand Ronde. And so that was exciting because it had a conservation easement on it. It was enrolled and acquired through the WWMP. And it's a historic landscape, and it's right in our backyard. It's from my office, it takes about 8 minutes, I think, to drive there. So extremely close. And so everything went through, and then the tribe closed on the property in May of 2019. So yeah, the total is 662 acres. It's mostly prairie and savanna. It's got some wet prairie and then some oak woodlands. And so we're looking at doing a large oak thinning project in partnership with Lomacotsi Restoration Project through an OWEB grant. And so that'll happen in 2022. But yeah, that acquisition was a big one for us and very exciting.
Awesome. And now we do have another question that came through. Does the tribe manage any state or federal forest lands? If so, how do they manage it differently than the owners?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. To my knowledge, right now, there's no ownership of state or federal landscapes. The only thing that kind of comes to mind that might be somewhat close to that is Tillamook County was looking at, divesting isn't the right word. I think we purchased it. So parting with some lands in the Tillamook area. And so that's one example of county ownership transferring to the tribe. I don't know what the county management was for that, but it's on the closer to the coast, so it's got some really giant spruce and hemlock, and it's really beautiful piece. So other than that, I don't know of any, but what I can speak to is managing different than federal or state in terms of riparian area protections, wildlife tree protections. We do exceed the State Forest Practices Act on our landscapes. And so what that really means is, for an example, if we were looking at a timber harvest area, we are going to leave 6 green conifer trees per acre where state regulations are only 2. And I think one of those can be a snag or 2 of them can be, I don't know my details right well anymore, but tribal management is more of stewardship forestry versus production.
Mhm. Got it. And on maybe connected to that question a little bit is, well, you mentioned earlier about the RCPP and where POC landowners can, partner in or incorporate some aspects of traditional ecological knowledge on their land. How can folks learn more about that process if they're interested? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So what we're putting together for the RCPP would be something that could be utilized by other landowners who would be interested in, maybe not necessarily, enrolled in that program, just looking to incorporate TEK into their landscape management. So some of the things we kind of think about are plant selection. So are there culturally significant plants already existing on your property? If there are, how can those be enhanced? And if there aren't, what are a suite of species that we have? We have Wapato and Camas, which are a little bit more of a wetland species. We've got tarweed and brodea that are upland species, toughleaf iris, narrowleaf onion, just trying to think of some others, but it could be about plant selection. If you're looking at revegetating some of your sites, it could be how to reintroduce prescribed burning. It could be involving tribal perspectives in landscape design with some restoration prescriptions. So what we're putting together is a couple of videos, but there's also going to be, I think, a one-page flyer with some resources. So maybe a suite of actions that could be incorporated into the fold, and then also some contact information. So you could contact myself. You can contact the Tribal Native Plant Materials Program, Jeremy Oiwa, for potentially plant availability. So taking some of those materials and plugging them into your landscapes. We also have Greg Archuleta on staff. He's very knowledgeable about TEK. He works in the Cultural Resources Department as a cultural policy analyst, and we can connect you with folks to get some more information and have some conversations.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, I have one question coming in the chat. Oh, yeah, I would, this reminds me that Crispin is reminding me that it would be great to find out about views of the tribes on, or ideas regarding beaver on the landscape, or views about beaver as a partner in restoration. Are you able to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that a little bit. I don't have any personal direct experience with beaver impacting my restoration projects. So I think some other people have, and that can definitely cause heartburn. But yeah, beaver would definitely be seen as a partner to restoration activities, certainly creating those dynamic landscapes with backflowing water and creating more of a floodplain. We would definitely be supportive of beaver in the area. And the only thing I can really say is that I know that they can be a nuisance, and I know that they can kind of chomp down some of the trees that were planted. But I'd be interested in encouraging them to stay on the landscape and exist in symbiosis. And I know that sometimes tree cages can help with some of the planting that has just been established to kind of help protect that. But we've had beaver be an issue in other areas as well. It kind of depends on the site, the goals, and if and I don't have an answer on this, but if you can encourage that beaver to choose somewhere else, I think we'd really focus on keeping that animal there versus any sort of removal.
Great. Well, there's still time for questions. I do not want to dominate or make anyone think I'm dominating the question asking, but I do have another. You briefly touched on climate change, and in the way that you're planning ahead by growing different kinds of plants for restoration projects. Can you speak a little bit about that and how that's being developed to plan for the future?
Yeah, so everything is sort of just experimental right now, since we kind of suspect that things are going to warm, but we don't really know anything other than that. And what we're kind of doing is looking at microclimates. And so Bonneville Environmental Foundation has pursued a grant to kind of evaluate these. And so we're involved in a few work groups. So that application was with other partners as well, other watershed councils too. So trying to look at what do we know now, and what information do we have that's going to give us a hint about what could potentially happen. So what that kind of means for us particularly is some of the North Santiam sites. I'm really interested in, are they already adapting to climate change? And can we, I'm really focused on, can we collect seeds there and then replant them as 1 or 2 year old trees to try to protect some of that genetic integrity, as compared to bringing in outside genetics. I don't know which one's right. I don't know which one's going to do better, but we're sort of looking at that on the landscape. And it's kind of too early to tell, because some of our sites have just been replanted this year. And we did one planting last year. So not a true hard, fast research study by any means, but sort of anecdotally keeping notes and looking at what are the microclimates that we have on our properties, where have the genetics come from where we're planting, how well are the seeds doing that we've seed sourced specifically within that site. And there's a lot of conversations about helping vegetation, assisted migration, basically. And I'm interested to know, are some of the sites that we have right now, are they already adapting?
Got it. All right. Well, I'm gonna let this go a little bit longer, just to see if anyone has any burning questions. I know we have till 8 o'clock, but yeah, we don't have to continue till 8 if there are no more questions. So, is there anything, Lindsay, that you thought you might not have time to bring up, but now perhaps?
No, I mean, I'm just really interested in the fire conversations. I know that our fire staff have been to tribal trainings, like down in the Yurok area in California, where they're doing a lot of spring burning, and they're kind of burning all year round. And I really am interested in their use of traditional fire practices and the applications on the landscape. And I'm really interested in taking that model and applying it here, because I really think that reintroduction of fire on the landscapes could really help slow down the cost for habitat restoration and maintenance, reduce the use of mechanical treatments, certainly reduce the amount of herbicide that's being put on the ground. But yeah, I just think it's a more holistic approach to habitat management, and the maintenance benefits far exceed the costs. And it's something that could be done on a 3 to 5 year timeline cycle. So I'm just really interested in how that might play out in the next decade in our area.
Absolutely. We have a request, if it's okay with you, to have an email address for anyone to contact you directly.
Yeah, totally. So let me see. Am I still sharing my screen?
You are.
Okay, so let me go. Let's do this. So if we can do that. So there's my email address and my phone number. Happy to have any follow-up conversations, ideas, partnerships on projects.
Fantastic. And I actually, I'm curious, since you brought up the fires and your desire, the tribe's desire to have more, have a better ability to use that more as a tool. Do you have a site, kind of a success story where maybe before you weren't able to use fire as a management tool, but then you were able to do that, and any differences that you've seen, like positive results from that?
Yeah, so what I can say is kind of two examples that jump to mind are on the tribal reservation, which I didn't really talk about, but I would just like to maybe point out one thing. So where I came from, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you know, there's lots of tribes there. I'm from a tribe. When we talk about reservation, it's mostly housing, infrastructure, the government, community. What I really fell in love with Grand Ronde is there is infrastructure and housing in the community, but what they call the reservation is the forest. So it's 10,200 timbered acres, managed for multiple uses: recreation, fish and wildlife habitat, timber production. I just thought that was really neat, and like, what a concept. And so fire use on the reservation has been really, I think, impactful. So like I mentioned before, site preparation for planting is all done with burning. And then we also manage about 100 acres for deer and elk forage. We call them elk meadows. So what we've noticed is that burning on the landscape versus mowing those meadows has basically created more vegetation control for a longer time. So those meadows are constantly being encroached by fir and salal and other things that want to grow there. So that's one example. We just noticed that it's been effective, more effective than mechanical mowing. The other thought that I wanted to point out is I have I'm not sure yet answer, because we're going to be looking at, we have a property down by Monroe called Rattlesnake Butte. It's named that because there are western rattlesnakes there, but it's an oak woodland, prairie oak savanna habitat type. And we've had some success with some Fish and Wildlife Service grants over the past 3 years at restoring some prairie habitat components. And so what we're going to be looking at is now fine tuning the grass and the forb plant community. And we're going to hopefully be looking at prescribed fire in kind of 1 acre plots and what the plant response is to that. Because ideally, I'd like to look at returning fire to that landscape for long-term maintenance, you know, burning on a cycle of every 3 to 5 years. But in the restoration phase, can we use fire instead of reaching for other tools first? So that is a to be continued.
Nice. Great. Well, I'll look forward to hearing how that goes. Oh, and here we have, let's see, we have a thank you, a bonjour, Lindsay. I'm probably going to not pronounce this correctly, but miigwech for your robust and relevant presentation. I was in and out a bit, so I hope I'm not asking you something you already discussed. Can you speak to anything Grand Ronde or other Pacific Northwest tribes are doing regarding the toxic aerial spraying?
Oh boy, yeah, tough question. I can't really speak to that. Here's what I will say is that the tribe doesn't do any aerial spraying. And I think that what I've heard is that that some of the counties, the local counties around here, have started to ban aerial spraying. So I don't have my facts straight on this, but I thought I heard something about Lincoln County banning aerial spraying. I don't know much about other counties. I can't really speak to other tribes, but I will say it's not a common conversation. And so I feel like if that's not a conversation that's being talked about, it's probably not something that's a common practice. Again, I can't speak for other tribes. I can just speak for us, and that, you know, it's an extreme tool. And, you know, I just think that it would have to be an extreme case for a situation like that to happen. And I mean, it really depends on the goals of the site, but for our timber production, it's just hasn't been necessary.
Great. And to continue on with the questions here, I wonder if you could speak to Latin classification systems and native names, understandings, relationships, to traditional ecological knowledge. I'm seeing some positive movement toward a return to indigenous knowledge and language.
Yeah, you know, all I can really touch on about that is that, you know, we do have some cultural experts on staff at the tribe, and certainly TEK experts, but you know, Latin names and connections to tribal plants or nouns or anything like that is, I just don't have any experience with that. I wish I had a better answer for you on that question. It's a great question. I don't have any personal experience with that.
Understood, definitely. And then on a related subject, I get discouraged with people foraging, especially mushrooms, and taking everything they see and and leaving the land torn up and littered. How can we be better protectors and allies for our water, Mother Earth, and our plant and animal relatives? Yeah,
great question. I mean, you know, I think it starts with personal responsibility, and it sounds like whoever is asking that question is an extremely responsible person. But it starts with, yeah, the personal responsibility in just taking your own actions. I always think that I've loved a short snippet of a quote that more is caught than taught. And so being the example that you want to be and want others to do is the best encouragement, is to lead by example and just be that person. But yeah, that's a really tough question. I think that unfortunately it can kind of be a default setting to take everything now because you don't know what's going to happen later. But really the tribal perspective is to take a little bit now and manage it so there will be plenty for the future. Yeah, I just don't have a good answer because, you know, we can only influence those who want to listen, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I've been speaking from a book that I've recently read, and I have way more to learn, and I'm not an expert at all and would never claim to be. But have you read a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass?
No, I believe I've heard of it. That sounds familiar. I haven't read it myself.
I would say that if anyone was interested in learning more about strategies in your own personal life or those around you and your family or your friends, in encouraging that kind of ethic with rekindling a relationship with the earth and being of it instead of, you know, over it, and incorporating some of that traditional ecological knowledge, I would encourage that to check out that book, see if it resonates with you the way it resonated with me. I'll just put it in the chat just in case anyone might be interested. And one more question I have here from, it sounds like she knows you, so I'm going to say it's Emily Haas. I'm curious how you work with state or federal agencies to influence their management of lands in a more traditional and sustainable way. Also, hi, Lindsay.
Hey, Emily. Yeah, thanks for the question. Excellent question. So we work with state and federal agencies in a couple different ways. You know, we have annual meetings with some of the national forests. So we have memorandums of agreement between, or memorandums of understanding between the entities. But really, I think what it comes down to is like on a project by project basis. And a lot of times folks will by default have to kind of connect with the tribe prior to any project implementation. So we get to kind of weigh in that way. We also get to build relationships and foster them on a staff to staff level. And then we also work with, you know, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in lots of different ways. For example, there's a great example that's happening right now, working with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and North Sandium Watershed Council on some of the fires, like the Beachy Creek fire, and having some log salvage. So looking at, instead of having those logs just decked up and milled, how can we plug those into habitat restoration projects? And so been in contact with some staff about how we can get some of those resources for our landscape. So I think it goes both ways in terms of influencing management practices, but it's also just the awareness. And I think where it really happens, my experience is where it happens is on the staff level. It's the ground level, and it's connecting, it's fostering those relationships and those partnerships, and just kind of picking up the phone and making those connections. And that's one thing that I've really enjoyed about my job is I think a lot of people get into this field to kind of work outside alone in the woods. That's all great. Field work's awesome, but something I didn't anticipate in this role and that I've really loved is just the connections that I built with Suzanne and with others, is just you can do so much more when you have those connections, and everyone chips in a little bit. And so kind of plugging away, filling those roles, filling the restoration deficits with people who might have something at the time, or where can we lend a hand when someone else is in need. So yeah, it's been great to kind of build those connections.
Thank you, Lindsay, and I completely agree. I've also gotten into this work because when I was younger and just starting out in my environmental career, I was interested in the wildlife, of course, the conservation part of it. But as I grew older and had more experiences, I realized how deeply important it is to cultivate the connections between people and the land. And without that, there can be no true stewardship of our land for the future, for future generations. So I value the partnerships and the conversations we've had as well with you and with so many others. So.
No, I love that. And you're kind of hitting on something that maybe didn't come through as strongly on the presentation, but we talk a lot about tribal trauma and history and what has happened or hasn't happened. But when we look at the landscape, people have been here, even before Western settlement happened, these landscapes were managed by people, and people were here, and people are part of it. And so yeah, it's just connecting people to those landscapes. I love that.
Absolutely. Well, at this point, I want to just again thank everyone for attending the presentation. Thank you especially to Lindsay for your wonderful talk and all the insights and the description of what the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde are doing on the landscape in the Willamette Valley and into the future. So I appreciate that.